Hello, hello, my Black History uh, readers, those of you who enjoy reading about Black history, especially those of you who enjoy collecting stories for the young people in your life, your children, your nieces, your nephews, grandchildren, godchildren, whatever it may be, whatever the relationship may be between you and those young readers, those minds, those scholars that you are helping to shape. We are here to share with you those stories that may be of interest to you to add to your library. And I don't try to keep it necessarily books that are always nice and neat. I do try to keep them respectful, books without vulgarity and things like that, because we are catering to younger readers. But sometimes we are also introducing our young readers to the many great influences in our community. And because our community is not a monolithic community, we are not sharing with them just the ones that we can package nicely and neatly. And so I say that because the book that I have for you today is Up Close, WEB, and we usually say Dubois, which is the French way. But my understanding is that Dubois did not actually say his name as Dubois. He actually said it as Dubois, or Dubois. Dubois, yes. Uh, very different than what most of us are accustomed to saying. So not Dubois, but Dubois. Dubois. So I usually say Dubois, and I understand that that is not exactly the correct way. But anyway, most of us do say W.E.B. Du Bois, or some who are of the intellectual sect, those who are deep within the African diaspora culture, they usually say his name, Du Bois, like voice. Yes. So anyway, with that being said, that is the book that we are looking at today, Up Close, W.E.B. Du Bois, the activist, and it's written by Tonya Bolden. Very interesting that there is a book for young readers to engage in, because I don't really see him being talked about for young readers. Maybe small little inserts into books that are about Black figures, historical figures overall. But very seldom do we actually see him as the sole subject. So I had to pick this book up from the library because it was quite interesting that this particular library that I've been talking about, where I picked up all of these books that we have that we're sharing with you, all of these books were picked up from a library here in the Houston area in Pearland that I would never have expected to find these type of books. And I was surprised that they actually had more books than the books in the Black neighborhood, at least the one that I went to. So I was really surprised, and that is a good thing, because that means that even though our officials are trying to shut down or remove our voices from the public spaces, those public spaces are pushing back, and they are keeping our institutions, our libraries, filled with the culture that make up our nation. And every culture has those individuals who may be a bit controversial. They may not be packaged neatly. And the truth is, none of our leaders are really packaged neatly unless they sold themselves. So even Dr. King was not packaged neatly. Fannie Lou Hamer, not packaged neatly at all. And so I thought this would be a good book, a bit controversial. So those of you who do have this, do consider this book. It's a good book to have a conversation with your young person. And so it's interesting that this was in the children's section. I think it would be good for young people, um, older children, because it could become, well, you know what? No, because you are teaching them and you are the historian. So embrace it as the historian. And I will say this, one of the things that my sister did when I would buy books for my niece and nephew. And that's really how this started, because I was buying books for my niece and nephew to add to their library. They were little young children. They're of mixed heritage. Their father's from Spain, and of course, my sister. Um, we share the same mother and father. So, and I thought it was my responsibility as the auntie, the only auntie that they have, because my brother in law only has a brother, and he's not married, and I am the auntie. So, with that being said, I thought it was my responsibility to make sure that they were educated and learned um, in the ways of our culture. And so, one of the things my sister did to make sure that my niece and nephew were learning the information, because sometimes the books were dealing with subjects that were a bit difficult, she read the books with them, along with them, and sometimes read the book to them, and then they would have discussions. And so, that I think is a great idea with this particular book that we're going to read on today. So, in keeping with what we've been doing, we won't read extensively, but just a little bit of the book. So we're going to start with chapter 3. At this point, he is now in school. So he writes and he says, "Our university is very pleasantly situated overlooking the city," Willie wrote Reverend Scudder. Yes, the young scholar was having a fine time at Fisk. "But I have not forgotten to love my New England hills," he assured his benefactor. Willie had entered Fisk as a sophomore because his up north education surpassed that of most young Southerners, and most Fisk students were Southerners. For Willie, being at Fisk was like being at that 1st of August celebration. It was so exhilarating not to be a minority and to be alive. Shortly after he started college, he was felled by typhoid fever. Interesting way of putting it. Once back from the brink, Willie did well academically, from Greek, Latin, and German to philosophy and physics, and he relished that, as he did lending his voice, baritone, to Fisk Classical Music Choir, the Mozart Society. He didn't join, but he adored the Fisk Jubilee Singers, famous for their rendition of Steal Away, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and other spirituals, Bible based songs on suffering and hope born in the souls of blacks in bondage. Singing was a lark, working on the school newspaper, the Fisk Herald, a passion. Senior year, Willie was editor in chief and not shy about publishing himself. His novella, Tom Brown at Fisk, was serialized in the Herald, winter 1887 through 1888. This story about a country boy finding self-worth and a sweetheart at Fisk begins. Oh, she was so tired. The long road stretched on until it was lost in the gathering twilight. It's hard to be a woman, but a black one? This fictional young woman is feisty Fisk student Ella Boyd, seeking a temporary teaching post in rural Tennessee. Willie had taught in the country for 2 summers and had seen how hard it was to be a poor black person in the South, where yearly scores of blacks were lynched, murdered by a mob, whether hanged from a tree or killed in some other gruesome way. Lynching was a continuing and recurrent horror during my college days, Willie later wrote. Each death was a scar upon my soul. Whenever he left campus, he was careful and braced for racial insult. The cabin in which he taught was an insult. Backless benches, no door, few books. Some of his students were bright and eager. Others didn't even know they lived in Tennessee until he started teaching geography. For those who have the good of the race at heart, this is an excellent field of work, he wrote in the Heels of Tin for the Fisk Herald, where he constantly challenged fellow students to think and act big. Why isn't there a Fisk student at Leipzig or a Fisk metaphysician at Berlin? He asked in his April 1888 editorial. Weren't blacks smart enough for these grand German universities? 2 months later, on graduation day, Willie gave a speech on a German he idolized, Otto von Bismarck. By the early 1870s, mostly through warfare, this Prussian prime minister had wrangled more than 30 independent Germanic states into one nation, the German Empire. Bismarck, said Willie, was a prime example of the power and purpose, the force of an idea, and showed what a man can do if he will. By graduation day, 1888, the will powered young man from Great Barrington had made Burghardt part of his illustrious name. He was signing letters W.E.B. Du Bois. As historian David Levering Lewis put it, Willie is no more. Chapter 8. O silent God, those whose voice afar in mist and mystery hath left our ears a hungered in these fearful days. September 1906, the start of the poem Du Bois began writing during his anxious journey home from Lowndes County, Alabama. He was doing research there for a Census Bureau project when word reached him of atrocities in Atlanta. Hear us, good Lord. In their appeals for white voters, contenders for Georgia's governorship, Hawk Smith and Clark Howell, had been whipping up fear and loathing for blacks. Then, on Saturday, September 22nd, several white-owned Atlanta newspapers ran some never substantiated stories of black on white crimes, including the rape of white women. Whites crowded downtown Atlanta that evening. We beseech thee to hear us, good Lord. The gathering became a mob 10,000 strong. We are not better than our fellows. Lord, we are but weak and human men. Someone shouted, kill the niggers! Have mercy upon us! Black homes, businesses, and schools were trashed and burned. Black people were clubbed, stabbed, strung up on poles, riddled with bullets. A baby was held up for target practice. A crippled boy beaten to a pulp. Red was the midnight. The terror lasted 4 days. When Du Bois reached Atlanta, he found Nina and 6-year-old Yolanda terrified but unharmed. Still, he got a hold of a double-barreled shotgun. If a white mob stepped on the campus, I would without hesitation have sprayed their guts all over the grass. Selah. Done at Atlanta in the day of death, 1906. These words close Du Bois' poem, A Litany of Atlanta, published in The Independent in mid-October. Later that month, Du Bois received a letter from Edwin Seligman, a fellow professor and a leading member of New York City's progressive Jewish community. Seligman told Du Bois that he had been amazed and disgusted at the happenings in Atlanta, but perhaps I did not realize the horror of it all until I read your beautiful poem. The recently widowed Seligman, sorry, I don't know the Jewish name, how to pronounce it, but anyway, Seligman hoped that in the wake of the tragedy, Du Bois recognized, as he did, that there are really only 2 things worth living for in this world. One was the love of those near and dear. The other was work organic to one's soul. And then the last bit of reading, the more controversial side of our great thinker. Let me make sure this is the right. For people of color around the world, the development in or the developments in India were a source of hope. In 1947, after Mahatma Gandhi's year-long non-violent campaign, India's independence from Great Britain finally occurred. That inspired other colonized people to start or step up freedom campaigns. African liberation leaders, including Kwame Nkrumah from Great Britain's Gold Coast, born in 1909, like the NAACP, Nkrumah had been speaking out against imperialism since his youth, including when he was a student in the US at Lincoln University and the University of Pennsylvania. Nkrumah moved to Manchester, England in 1945, where he co organized the Fifth Pan African Congress, held there in mid October 1945. Du Bois was the guiding spirit. Young firebrands looked upon him as he had regarded Alexander Crummell, hailing Du Bois as the father of Pan Africanism. The reverence was a much needed lift for Du Bois, was bearing a personal burden. Shortly before he set out for England, Nina, like his mother, had a stroke, which left her paralyzed on her left side. It happened while she was in New York for the summer, staying at the Harlem YWCA, because her will wouldn't let her stay in his apartment. I can quite understand that you do not care for company, she had written, promising not to be a bother, only asking, wasn't there a couch on which she could sleep? This was several weeks after she suffered a bad fall in Baltimore. When Nina had a stroke, her will got her into one of New York City's best hospital, then headed for the Pan African Congress. Months later, when Nina was well enough to travel, she would return to Baltimore. Her will would pay for her to have an in-home care and would occasionally visit the home in which Yolanda and her daughter also still lived. Why not slow down, ease up, Arthur Spingarn and Louis Wright had asked Papa Du Bois. Perhaps only Shirley Graham could fully appreciate that. Though Du Bois was pushing 80, work was still his heavenly way. By 1945, Graham had written and produced several plays, and the first of her many books for young folks. There was nothing heavenly about Du Bois' situation at the NAACP. For one, he was given a small office after having asked for a space large enough to comfortably accommodate himself, his secretary, his many file cabinets, and 2,500 books. Du Bois' little office shared a wall with that of Thurgood Marshall, the brilliant and ruckus head of the NAACP Legal and Educational Defense Fund, which was challenging Jim Crow in the courts. Hooked on the crisis since he was a teenager, Thurgood Marshall was in awe of Du Bois, who apparently arranged his office to dissuade visitors. His whole office was fenced in with books that ran all around the room, Marshall recalled, and he never forgot the day he tried to break the ice. Look, Doc, your office and mine are side by side, and you come in here every morning and you just walk right by. As Du Bois entered his office, he said, yeah, that's one of my bad habits, then shut the door. NAACP Chief Walter White's main problem with Du Bois wasn't that he was aloof, but that he was a loose cannon, still promoting voluntary segregation and still very critical of Walter White's leadership. Plus, Du Bois was still praising the USSR and increasingly associating with communists, whose ranks included his girlfriend, Shirley Graham. In early September 1948, the NAACP decided that Du Bois had ceased to be of value. To Du Bois, neither gave up nor shut up. He accepted an offer from actor, singer, activist Paul Robeson, to serve as vice chair of the Council on African Affairs, CAA. Robeson, who chaired the USSR and criticized the US on several counts, racial injustice among them, had co founded the CAA in the late 1930s to keep Americans up on current events in Africa. The CAA could not give Du Bois a salary, but he had an office space in its Manhattan headquarters and use of its secretary. The CAA was among many groups on the U.S. Attorney General's list of subversive organizations. Another Red Scare was dawning. Tensions between the US and the USSR over post war sphere of influence had led to a Cold War. The USSR was pledging to the spread of communism, the US to stopping that. The Cold War had millions in the US and elsewhere fearing World War III and therefore promoting peace. Once again, Du Bois was in the forefront. Late March 1949, along with Paul Robeson and the white American playwrights Lillian Hellman and Arthur Miller, Du Bois was among the nearly 3,000 scholars, scientists, and artists at a peace conference held at New York City's Waldorf Astoria. "Why don't you go back to Russia, you stinking commies?" was one invective hurled by people picketing the conference. This conference was not called to defend communism, nor socialism, nor the American way of life, said Du Bois at a rally in Madison Square Garden on the conference's final day. It was called to promote peace. It was called to say and say again that no matter how right or wrong differing systems of beliefs in religion, industry, or government may be, war is not the method by which their differences can successfully be settled for the good of mankind. Late April 1949, along with Robeson, Shirley Graham, Spanish artist Pablo Picasso, and about 2,000 promoters of peace, Du Bois was in Paris for the founding of the communist-led World Peace Council. August 1949, he was at a peace conference in Moscow. By then, war had been declared on Paul Robeson. U.S. authorities, long wanting to silence him, seized upon an occasion to condemn him as un-American and turn the public against him. The pivotal moment came when the Associated Press, AP, put out a false report on Robeson's remark at the Paris Peace Conference. For starters, the AP claimed that Robeson had compared the U.S. government to Nazi Germany. Branded a traitor, Robeson soon found his career pretty much over in the U.S. What's more, many talented tinthers shunned him, but not Du Bois, who continued to have his say. And I'm sure from that little bit that I've read, you can see that Du Bois was rather a controversial figure, but he was also a very intellectual and very intelligent figure. And one of the things about him is that he had this belief that Black people, and sometimes his beliefs were a bit controversial, but he differed from Booker T. Washington in that he believed that Black people could accomplish more than just being those individuals who did hard labor. He believed that we had a mind and we should use that mind. Though sometimes he was a bit stuck, according to some, on colorism. Those things are debatable. But nonetheless, a very controversial figure, one to add to your young person's library, if not for when they're young, as they're getting older, to allow them the opportunity to develop and to come to the place of having thought. And that's what we want from this generation, not where they're being taught by society, but where they're being taught at home, at church, with the community elders, and then at school. And so we are the first shapers of their thought. But the truth is, if we're afraid of books where they hear about controversial figures, then guess what? At school and amongst their friends, they're going to hear controversial things. So it's a good thing to introduce them to individuals, our heroes, who are a bit unsettling. And this is very different from the other books that we've read. But I think it's a great thing to introduce our younger people because you are able to help shape and to guide them as they're learning about such figures. So, not everyone is neatly packaged, some of them are controversial, but they are still a part of our community and they are still great voices. And so, this is one that I think you might want to add. Depending, some of you may not, but some of you may want to add this one. We've got one more book that we will be sharing with you, and I think this one will be one that you'll want to add because it is a more recent situation about a more recent shero. And I think you all will want to add this book about her life, especially those of us here in Texas, because she is so important to us here in the state of Texas. And one that we are blessed to still have with us, who is a shero in the fight for justice and in the fight to preserve our history and us telling that history. All right, have a wonderful and a great one, and we will talk to you real soon as we share Black stories.